Hello and welcome back to Property Matters on Dublin South FM with myself, Carol Tallon. You can contact us on Twitter at iPropertyRadio or email hello@iPropertyRadio.com. So I'm now joined by Robert Nowlan, Planning and Property Advisor at W Nowlan Associates. Robert, thank you for being with us today.
No problem, Carol. Thanks for having me.
I'm delighted. Robert, today I reached out to you because I wanted to discuss a very big topic, and I don't know how we're going to squeeze it in just a few short minutes. But I'm been following some of the work that your firm has been doing in terms of sustainability, and that's definitely a conversation that we want to have today. But perhaps for members of our audience who aren't familiar, you might just describe the work that you and your team at W Nowlan Associates are involved in.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Well, we're chartered planning and property consultant. My background would have been originally property surveying for a number of years, and then I would have moved on and done a master's in town planning. So I would have worked with a few very well known planning consultants around Dublin, and I'm involved into setting up my own company, as I always thought there was probably a synergy between planning and surveying. So I suppose back in 2015, I would have set up W Nowlan Associates. So largely we kind of bring property and planning together. It was something that isn't hugely common over here. You're either a surveyor or you're a planning consultant, and you very much run in planning consultant, you run planning applications and development plan submissions. So I always thought there was scope to bring the property element into it and not leave it behind. I suppose, I went to college, I did it, and I always felt like that there was as I said, a synergy between the two. So at the start, we very much kind of were feeling it out with clients, and what our work would have entailed was, initially buying properties, setting up almost planning asset strategies for those properties, and actually developing it out, running planning applications where it need to be, and adding an uplift to those assets. Our portfolio, kept on growing in terms of, we were working with kind of high profile kind of property owners in terms of working kind of development lands and rezoning submissions, and then again we got into social housing element. I worked with Dublin Simon for a number of years and doing a large acquisition of about 250 units for them. So that was over a 3-year period, and then that evolved into kind of doing other work for another party with Oakley Housing. We kind of brought them sites and did a lot of planning work for them. So there was various kind of, it kind of evolved, Carol. We kind of did it on a whim at the start. We didn't know if the two would work necessarily together, but the feedback has been fantastic, and we've been involved in some really nice schemes and projects. So yeah, and it's, we've kind of evolved into, we're very much in large kind of projects of 400 or 500 units now with the strategic housing application process. So, we kind of, we like to think of ourselves as a one-shop stop.
Very good, very good. Well, I can see that would make sense from a property developer's point of view.
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems like a better fit.
Yeah, and I suppose, when property developers come to us, we kind of very much, I call it the 360 health check, where we kind of do a review of the asset before there is planning, but there's also kind of a property angle. I suppose the way I look at it is pure planning kind of looks at the policies and the design, the height, the density, I suppose. But every property like that, or every application like that, there's an economic residual value that comes into it that needs to be taken into consideration. So, when I was purely doing planning applications for planning consultants previously, when I was working in that field, sometimes I suppose the loss of a floor wasn't necessarily taken as an economic issue. But I think when you bring the two together, you very much understand why the loss of certain elements of development can make a scheme not feasible. So I think the two work very nicely together, and I really enjoy that element of it. That coming up with a strategy and seeing around corners in terms of seeing angles that people might necessarily see, are kind of increasing the value of an asset through planning. Which is very rewarding.
Okay, your firm is based in Dublin. Do you
Yeah,
think that Dublin has shown itself to be progressive in terms of planning policies?
yes and no.
Very, very diplomatic answer, Robert.
Well, you're going to ask me to expand here, so I think I think we're back where we were, back in the mid to kind of late 90s in terms of all the same questions are starting to come up, and I suppose it's it's what happens when growth happens, I suppose. But we're starting to hear all, like, if you produced a newspaper or the property section back in the 1996, you'd probably see density, high rise, public transport, suburban sprawl, leapfrogging, all these things that are very much discussion points at the moment. Dublin City is a fantastic city, but I think we're in a bit of a crossroads in terms of where we're going height wise, also density wise, and the bottom line is we're evolving. This is a world, shall we say, trend whereby, I think by 2040, just 70% of people will live in urban areas. And when you look at Brexit and you look at what's happening in America, it is showing that rural areas and particularly the young population want to be in those urban centres. And I think Ireland's population by 2040 is going to grow by 1 million people. So we really need to put those people in the right places where we can use services, and we can, I know you're from a farming background, but I don't think necessarily we can keep going down our one-off housing route, because it's not serving the country well. It's not making towns sustainable in terms of, if you go to France, for instance, if you go into the rural areas, most of the farming population live in those little towns, and they're not allowed. The suburban sprawl is non-existent. So, but the problem is we have a national planning framework that, is out of sync with some elements of what people want,
When you say it's out of sync, what do you mean? Because you referred to some of these villages in France, and it would be similar in Spain.
Yeah.
And I observed the same thing you do, but I think I come to perhaps a different conclusion, and that is, it's certainly across northern Spain, when you're walking through villages, you see farmers would actually cycle out with their equipment attached to the bike, because they're living in the town. The original farmhouse is falling to rack and ruin. You can see that. And one of the things we saw, I was over, maybe years, 7, 8, 9 years ago now at this stage, doing a documentary about these abandoned villages across northern Spain. And part of that was driven by, maybe there wasn't the vitality in the rural areas that there ought to be. And I'm not sure it's as simple as put everybody into the town centres and city centres, but I appreciate that that's not that's not the predominant planning view. But it's something that I really struggle with, actually, particularly, like, I'm really heartened but I'm an optimist. I'm very heartened by the hub and spoke model of co-working spaces that's encouraging people not necessarily to work from home, but being able to work remotely, as in from innovation hubs up and down, the west of Ireland, as opposed to having to commute into Galway City or Limerick City or Dublin City. Am I overly optimistic here? Am I missing the bigger picture, Robert?
No, look, I think we were probably evolving to that kind of 4-day or 3-day week, in the office, and then 2 days remotely. And I think you have to build it and they'll come. I think there is a strong argument that you create strong hubs in villages and towns, and that people will want to live in those things. But in terms of, I'm dealing with some sites at the moment, which are in the greater Dublin area, but in small, struggling towns that have probably lost their retail capacity to stronger, bigger centres, and they're struggling. And you're wondering, because at the end of the day, a population changes a town. It creates support for, your post office, your retail. But like if you drive through a lot of small towns in Ireland, they're desolate. Their pubs are gone, their post office is shut. And there is that fine line where you're trying to bring life back into those communities and bringing because the population will change those towns if they're servicing those, if they're using those services. So, and if you actually, sorry, going back to my planning days in college, if you actually look at the breakdown of the cost and the environmental cost to a one-off house compared to a house using electric, sewerage system within a town centre, and the cost is huge in terms of that one-off house, and they're invisible costs that you and me don't see. They're the road to get there. There's the sewerage tanks the septic tank that's polluting the local river. There's the electrical cables. There's the journey time in and out of the towns. There's all these things that kind of create a really non-sustainable housing kind of structure, really.
Yeah, and actually that's one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about today, because I accept that my view is not where we need to be going in terms of planning what's best for the country. It's certainly not what I would interpret as being laid out in the National Planning Framework. And one of the things I mentioned to you before we came on air is that through PropTech Ireland, there's a global movement called PropTech for Good, and we have signed up through PropTech Ireland to be ambassadors for helping the planning, construction and property industries in Ireland work towards achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals as set out by the UN. And when you read them, they absolutely make sense. There's nothing there that you say, no, I wouldn't be supportive of this. Absolutely, we want to help end poverty. We want zero hunger is absolutely what we should be striving for. In terms of well-being, and that feeds into our built environment. And one of the really important things for me that I see is industry innovation and infrastructure, because I think that's been really lacking in Ireland. And I think there's huge intersections between an efficient planning system that promotes viable development and then sustainable development. And one of the things that we've seen already, and in fact we've spoken about here in the show previously, is that at the moment, the sustainability agenda is being driven, from where I can see it, it's being driven by some state agencies through whether smart city initiatives. We're certainly seeing it through the PropTech sector, but the buyers of those, so the people who are putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak, they're definitely the REITs and other bodies whose financing depends on this. So they have to show not just sustainable aspirations. They need to actually set out what the roadmap they're doing to achieve this, because we know the built environment is responsible for nearly 40% of carbon emissions. So we know there's a big role that this industry has to play. Maybe what we don't know is how. It feels like such a big conversation, and like every big conversation, it's difficult to start.
But there's so many, there's so many elements to it in terms of, for example, I've always said that, and I was kind of hoping it would be pushed through in the last budget, if it, is the Metro, in terms of delivering that to Dublin, and because it's such an important piece of infrastructure in many ways, and we kind of grapple with, we're looking at, we have to provide 33 to 36,000 units, and we're only providing 18,000 per annum at the moment, and it's not going to be great. I think next year they're looking at just under, sorry, I have the figures here, but I think it's under, 16, it's 18 next year. So we're well below where we need to be in terms of delivering, units. And the problem is, this is a kind of key time. We're going to see mass unemployment in terms of what's happened in COVID, and big public infrastructure projects like this are because they're far-reaching, because what would happen here is, because Dublin is so it's a small city, and we have these very much defined kind of zoned areas. But if we were to provide something like a metro, we can very much disperse the land values and start putting kind of medium to higher density zones in the suburbs where people, can, have a metro where they can travel relatively quickly into the city, and they don't need to be in those locations. And I always have said it's a prime opportunity to kind of spread land values and reduce that, congested, kind of management of those areas where, for example, the Lewis is very much, dispersed land values a little bit, but you see it because, land values along the Lewis and the Dart lines are far greater than they are in other areas of Dublin. And if you did the same with the Metro, that would very much help distribute, or kind of hopefully relieve those high land values and those high unit values.
Can that be? Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there, Rob, but can that be achieved through Bus Connects, do you think?
Yeah, there's the argument where they say, buses actually serve the Irish, or particularly the Irish city better than a rail network would, or a metro, because it can get into all those residential areas that unfortunately our planning system has been a suburban sprawl system, so it's very hard to service through a metro. But at the same time, the metro is also about making that link to the airport and getting, so there's a tourist play, there's an economic play, there's a lot that goes with that.
Okay, but there's also, you're talking about improved transport infrastructure, which is crucial. That requires unlocking land, and if the premise for doing this is that we can promote higher density residential, we know what happens when we try to increase the densities, because it inevitably means increasing heights, and then we inevitably get pushback from the communities. Through public consultation. The reality is we all want everybody to be housed. We all want everybody to be housed affordably. Nobody wants to give up their view to make it happen.
Yeah, and that's, I suppose you probably saw Johnny Rowan's application for 45 stories in the docks at the moment, and I suppose we are in that period of, where this conversation, even when we were back in college, 15 years ago, this was very hot topic. And in terms of Dublin, you'll have various kind of, like, I suppose Kieran Cuff would be we're a low-rise city, and that we're a Georgian city, and the high-rise doesn't necessarily belong here. But I remember being in London as a child, and that London was not terribly high-rise up until 15, 20 years ago, and London is a Victorian Georgian city, and it's very much, the thing that when I drive around Dublin at the moment is that high-rise in the right places, and Dublin City Council are right in terms of they highlighted the areas where it can go in the Docklands, down in Houston Quarter and various other areas, but sometimes quality of design, I think, and I kind of that really sometimes I feel like that our public planners haven't challenged the private developer in Dublin too much. When you drive down the docks, it's a 6 to 7 story. It can be a little bit mundane when you look at it, in terms of it doesn't really challenge the eye. And I think my worrying part is if we go high, I think there's an uncomfortable lack of context there when we go high, because there isn't that height at the moment. So we're in that uncomfortable phase of where we're low rise and we're trying to go medium to high. And I think, I think private developers need to be pushed on design. I think some of the stuff that's been built doesn't, you go to London and New York, and it's, some of the landmark buildings are amazing. Or Bilbao, you go there, which is a relatively new city in terms of height, and there's some very quirky designs. And I think we can be very conservative here. We're low rise, and we try and maximize our floor plates through very large bulky floor plates when you go down the docks. And some of the buildings, look, there's some buildings like Capitol Dock have been built, and they're pushing the boundaries a little bit. But the U2 tower was previously there and was a lot more groundbreaking than what is there now. So I think planners need to be challenged both privately and publicly.
Do you think there's an appetite for change? And I'm conscious that we're coming close to our time here, but you know, the fact that we're having this conversation, and I know certainly 2 years ago, you know, this show was dominated, particularly when Owen Murphy was housing minister. It was dominated by this conversation about heights, and I think you've made a really good point there that actually, you know, the height is only one aspect of this, and that design maybe hasn't featured. And one of I'm not an urban planner, but one of the things that I would feel quite strongly about is that a city is a living organism. So I don't think it should be preserved. There are elements that you want to see preserved historically. However, I think that the face of a city should change over time. The skyline should change over time, and that's something that I can see. There's fractions across Dublin planners about this. I don't think that they're in agreement at all. I think there's some that are very proactive, and maybe some that are very much rooted in the traditional. And I see merit in both. However, I think for the strength of a city and for the vitality, we have to allow it to evolve into the next iteration of what it's going to be. The skyline has to be allowed to evolve.
I think, just to quickly, you know, I think there's a little bit of frustration there. You know, private developers are trying to push the envelope in terms of they've been given those ministerial guidelines to push on with the heights. And I suppose, you know, it kind of a little bit jumped the gun a little bit, because, you know, development plans and Dublin City Council have to implement their development plan, and these ministerial guidelines go outside those development plans. So there's a bit of frustration there because they have to follow that line. Like a prime example would be, you know, the Salesforce building in the Docklands, and that saga that's been going on. And you can kind of see where the private developers coming from, trying to push the envelope and maximize the, you know, the potential of that building and what the user wants. But then you got to understand, and because that SDZ will be compromised and is dead once that permission goes over the limitations set by the strategic development zone. So there, I understand where both parties are coming from, and it's very frustrating. And, you know, from other strategic development zones in Cherrywood and Poolbeg, and I know that the same thing's going to happen there, that they'll want to push the densities because they're considered too low, and that they, you know, they need higher buildings can be accommodated in those locations. So I sometimes think there's a bit of a disconnect, and not a disconnect, but, you know, I entirely see they have to implement their development plan, and these ministerial guidelines have kind of pushed outside that development plan, and I suppose there's frustration on both parties, I would imagine. But you're right. Look, we have to, you know, if we're going to accommodate 1 million people, we can do medium density, we can do high density. You know, for example, you know, Rathmines and Portobello and all those areas are, you know, they're medium density. The amount of people that they fit into those areas. But, you know, in the core areas, of the Dublin Docklands, and they, you know, they can accommodate more, and the impact on that on the Georgian core isn't hugely negative in those locations. But the problem is we're tippy-toeing in height, and instead of just, you know, take the plaster off, instead of doing it slowly, and I think we're being overly conservative. And I think probably, you know, when you look at our past, Liberty Hall might be an example of where we're carrying the scars and the confidence from buildings like that we didn't necessarily don't pride ourselves in. But, you know, like Treasury Holdings have done some very good buildings, and I know it's, you know, some of the Google buildings, some of the Altra Vitro buildings they've done, and I just think sometimes we could have a little bit more confidence in our design, and have a bit of a German kind of element to it in terms of where they very much push the envelope in design and be a bit more risky. I think we've a very, you know, conservative skyline, shall we say.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you talk about the creativity. And look, this is something that I would love if we had more time even to discuss this. But the reality is, I think sometimes we overlook the fact that we have some amazing expertise in Ireland, some amazing expertise in terms of creative design, and some amazing expertise in terms of delivery. But unfortunately, most of the expertise gets delivered, most of the creative expertise gets delivered outside of Ireland, which is a source of frustration for the entire industry. But again, that almost feels like a larger conversation for another day. So we'll have to leave it there for now. That was Robert Nowlan, Planning and Property Advisor at W Nowlan Associates. Thank you again, Robert, for joining us on the show today. We need to take another quick break. Stay tuned.